Welcome to the Oneal Perspective, Politics, Power, and Policy, where we break down the latest in politics, dive deep into forces shaping our society, and uncover the policies that will make it all happen. Your host, Curtis Oneal, is here to educate, enlighten, and entertain as we explore the world of politics with clarity and insight. Whether you're a political junkie or just trying to be informed, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
And welcome to our episode of the Oneal Perspective. I am excited to be here today. I have my good friend here, Tony Gant, who we're today going to talk about criminal justice reform, alternative sentencing, things of that particular nature. And if you guys remember me, one of the things I love to do, I love to educate, enlighten, and if I get the opportunity to entertain, I'll do that too. But I really wanted to unpack a lot of this conversation today, and I brought an exceptional guest here today, Tony Gant, to help me to be able to do that. And he's going to share some of his experiences and some of his expertise on some of this particular subject matter. So with that being said, I'd like to go ahead and have Tony introduce himself. Tony, go ahead.
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me on. First and foremost, I'm excited. My name is Tony Gant, as our distinguished guest, our distinguished host, y'all edit that out, our distinguished host said, and I do a lot of criminal justice reform. I'm an advocate, and I've been working in that space for around 7 years. The reason it's a passion of mine is because I was incarcerated here in Michigan for 20 years, from 1995 to 2015. This May marks 10 years of me being home, so I'm excited about that. A lot of the work I do deals with the barriers that people with criminal histories face, people with convictions, around trying to get access to employment, housing, trying to turn their life around. Sometimes there's even barriers for folks trying to get into college. So a lot of my work centers on that. Some of the work I'm doing now does deal with sentencing reform, right? Awesome. And so last session we did have a number of bills here in Michigan that dealt with criminal legal reform that died during lame duck.
Wow.
A lot of the stuff from juvenile life without parole that died, where we were advocating and hoping that the legislator would make it illegal to sentence a child, right, to life without parole. There was some legislation that would have allowed sentencing judges to resentence people after 20 years if the sentencing judge thought that was appropriate. That died as well. Legislation around fair housing died. That would have made it more easier for folk with criminal histories to get access to housing. Right now, it's legal to discriminate against a person because they have a criminal conviction in Michigan, which often leads to folk recidivating, right, returning back to prison.
Correct. Because
they're struggling, they can't get their life back together, and we do that on a regular basis here in Michigan. So that's a lot of my fight.
Wow, and that's a huge fight, Tony. That's a big fight. You know, I know when you and I had talked, we talked about what some of those things that you just named as carceral collateral consequences. And in some spaces we call that the invisible punishments, right? Individuals go into prison, they serve their sentence only to get out of prison and face a lot of stigma and face a lot of those barriers. And I remember engaging in a conversation with you. You told me how many collateral consequences are there currently right now, and how many are in the state of Michigan?
Right. There's over 42,000 collateral consequences nationwide for people with conviction history.
Wow.
Over 800 in the state of Michigan. Most of those collateral consequences that we're talking about, those invisible punishments, exist in employment. So they're private sector housing, but there are also state collateral consequences where there are certain jobs that you'll never be able to get with a felony conviction. Some of that stuff has lightened, whereas it's easier to get some licensing, but there's still like real barriers to folk in the social workspace, folks coming out of college that want to be social workers and that have a felony conviction. Is really hard to get into that field sometime with that felony conviction. So there's still a lot of work to do around that.
Wow. And so I do know that one of the big focuses for individuals when they get out of prison, one of the major focuses a lot of the parole officers focus on is the individual getting a job. right? So an individual gets out of a job, and let's say, for example, he goes back to the county in which he committed the crime. And let's say, for example, he goes back to his mother's house, and although he wants to get a job, but there's no bus line, right?
Absolutely.
Not only is there a bus line, but he don't have a driver's license, so he can't drive.
Right.
So now the focus is for him to be able to get to work, but how is he going to get to work?
Absolutely.
And some of those things. And so that particular thing creates a whole new issue, right? Just something as simple as a driver's license. If he can't get a driver's license because he's probably been locked down for 20 years, right? You don't have the paperwork, the documentation, and Lord forbid, he don't have the family support.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit. Help me to unpack, and let's use your experience as an opportunity to see how you navigated through some of that space. So if you can talk to that a little bit.
Absolutely, Curtis. And when I was released, thankfully, I had a home to go to. Right, some folks don't, but I did have a home to go to. It was very difficult to get a job, and it is definitely true that your parole officer, your agent, is definitely on your back about getting a job. And so, because I was on parole and I had a violent offense, I couldn't even get jobs, and I paroled here to Lance, and I couldn't even get jobs through the staffing services. They wouldn't take me on. Some of them said, "Well, you got a violent offense." Some said, "Come back after you get off parole." Of course, my parole agent didn't like that idea. Come back when you get off parole. And so ultimately, I end up going to a place called Labor Ready. I think they've changed names, but basically for Labor Ready, you show up every day and you sign in and you hope you get a job. Right?
Oh, wow.
It may be a day job, 2 days, 3 days, and that's kind of how I had to start working. Ultimately, I was given, they called them tickets, Curtis. And you get a ticket, and they say you go work this temp job for 3 weeks. And I ended up working a temp job through Quality Dairy at the grocery warehouse, and I worked really hard. And they recommended me to get a job at the dairy plant. That was down on what is that? Washington. It's closed now. It's closed now. Where they made all the milk and the ice cream and all that stuff.
Oh wow!
So
he was an ice cream man.
No, I was in the warehouse.
Okay.
And I didn't even know how to drive a forklift, so I had to learn all this stuff. But ultimately, Curtis, the reason I advocate so hard is, one, if folk take a chance to hire somebody, that's coming home, and trying to get their life back together, you're going to get a hard worker.
Yeah.
Because they got a lot to prove, and they know it's going to be hard to get another job. So they're going to work really hard. I end up becoming warehouse supervisor at Quality Dairy before I left. And that's just because I was willing to show up every day and do whatever that needed to be done. And so a lot of times the stigma, the fears that folk have, they're unfounded. People get in trouble, and they never get in trouble again.
Wow.
But we still kind of punish them for the rest of their life.
Right. And, and it's funny because I know when we talk about, like you just said, crimes, recidivism, we know that, unfortunately, sex offenders, they recidivate a whole lot. But individuals that have maybe done time for murder or things like that has the lowest recidivism rate.
It does.
But yet instead, when we look at individuals that may have committed such offenses, we want to sort of throw them away, right? And I get it. It's a violent offense. No one wants that to be. But I think it's important for us to sort of focus on statistics and look at statistics in terms of that. In terms of that. Now, you did say something that when you got out, you had the support of your family. And talk to me in terms of what role did your family play in keeping you successful and supporting you.
Absolutely. So I paroled to my wife. She was here in Lansing, so I had somewhere to live. Okay. She had a car. Problem was, I think we were both very optimistic about what would happen once I was released. We were both I won't say misled, Curtis, but I think we both believed that if a person, I had educated myself, was willing to work, I would be able to hit the ground running.
Now, did you do this in the facility?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes. That happened while I was incarcerated. And so I think we thought, somebody willing to work and educated would be able to hit the ground running. That just wasn't true. That just was not the case. I think things have improved a bit just because, people need workers now.
Right.
But back then in 2015, it was very difficult, right?
Wow.
And so it was a single income in the household.
Mm-hmm.
She had a son. She was taking care of all of us.
Wow.
For all intents and purposes. And so that was a real struggle for a lot of months before I could even get any money coming in.
Wow. And I'm sure as a man, as a person who wants to assist in providing, that was frustrating for you.
Absolutely.
Frustrating for you. But let me sort of, say something. I think the last conversation we had, I don't know if it was you or somebody else, but I was also told that you had a successful business.
I did.
You had a successful business that you were, it was so successful that you ended up selling the business. Is that correct? So speak to me a little bit about that.
Well, one of the reasons I love QD is because my lawn care company was taking off so fast, and it was just impossible to do both, and I had to make a choice. And so, when I started, I was working QD, so I would get off work and I would work a really early shift. I would get off. I had a pickup and a lawnmower and a weed whip, and I would get off and hand out flyers and go cut grass, right? But it just really picked up, and ultimately, I had. I want to say my route was easy 30 clients, right?
Wow.
And I had all the stuff, the trailer, the warehouse, where I kept everything. And I sold it. And now I'm off to another business endeavor.
Wow.
But hard work does work. But we definitely, I think one of the things that I try to highlight, Curtis, is not everybody can deal with all those no's as well as everybody else.
Right.
Sometimes those doors being closed repeatedly for folk is enough to discourage them. And then we look at our community, we see some of those results when we don't make sure that people have access to basic needs.
Wow. And that's important. And Tony, I want to highlight that because again, I don't think that community society really focuses enough on your story, individual story. And you're not the only one. There are a number of individuals who've gotten out, who've returned home and have been successful.
Right.
And one of the things, and I also want to highlight this, and I don't know if the audience knows that my background is in corrections. I worked as an officer. I also ran facilities. I was a warden in several states. And I think this particular relationship that we have demonstrates that we can truly focus when we refocus our priorities and when we truly get to the heart of the matter, criminal justice is possible and opportunities can exist for individuals. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of people that do work in corrections and law enforcement, we have a heart. Many of our family members may be incarcerated. And so we have a heart and we do want to see change and we want to see effective change. But we also believe in accountability as well. And when an individual completes their sentence, they come back home, like Tony has he's ready to change and contribute to community. I think it's a win-win for everybody, but we need to do a better job of allowing those individuals the opportunity to prove themselves and remove some of these barriers that create and prevent effective change. So with that being said, Tony, I think, man, that you are a definite example, man, of where we need to move things to. So let's talk a little bit about some of your work that you have done in the past around policy. When we tend to look at a lot of the barriers, the issues that prevent successful reentry into community, which one would you say is the one that needs to automatically go away first and foremost?
I think I'm a little partial. I would say housing. The reason I focus so much on housing, Curtis, is housing is crucial to everybody, across the board. Think about when you're on a vacation. Even once you're on vacation for a while, you're ready to go back home.
Right.
When you go home is the place that you go and rest and refuel for the next day. focus your mind on the stuff you got to get done. It's almost impossible for folk to keep a job if they don't have somewhere to live, right? Just because of the stress and trauma of struggling with to find somewhere to live, right?
Right.
And so I think it's almost a no-brainer to say we need to figure out a way. And I get the concern of property owners saying that, hey, I want to make sure that we're bringing in somebody that's safe for the neighbors and the community. Find a way to balance that is what I'm trying to figure out. How do we balance that concern of property owners and also think about the fact that this is a real public safety concern. If we're really concerned, if we're really thinking about public safety in our community, it's common sense to know that folk that are getting out, if they don't have somewhere to live, they're likely going to become a problem for our community. So it's even in our own self-interest, right? Our own self-interest to try to figure it out. So I think that would housing, obviously employment. You need to be able to, you need a job. You need to be able to pay your bills. And take care of yourself. Transportation is a huge problem for folk when they're first coming home. But I caught the bus, Curtis. I caught the bus and walked. I did what you had to do. But yeah, transportation is a huge need for folk. And also I think a lot of folk in one of the things I'm doing now is consulting. One of my clients is heavy into trying to figure out how we deal with the trauma of folk that have been she calls it post-traumatic prison disorder. So she's really working heavily in that space, trying to figure out how do we ensure that folks that are getting out do have the mental health care that they need as they're exiting.
And that's so important, Tony. I will sort of make myself a little vulnerable here too. And as you know, I worked many years in prisons, and I can tell you, as an officer, one of the first things I would do when I go into the housing units, I was always make sure that my back was against the wall. I even do that now when I go into restaurants. I sit with my back against the wall. I want to be able to see all areas. I'm cautious of garbage cans. I'm cautious of unlocked doors, all of that kind of stuff. And it's because of the years that I spent in institutions, in prisons, right? And a lot of people probably say, well, that's probably some symptomology of PTSD or whatever that may be, because you're in high pressure environments, right?
Constantly,
and you're vigilant. I don't want to say,
you
have to be vigilant, right? Because safety is paramount, right?
Absolutely.
So, and so with that being said, especially for individuals that may have been there for a number of years, that may have cellies or may have been in a dorm style room or something like that. Some of those individuals may have been traumatized through violence, blanket parties, all kinds of stuff, and the other ills that go along with that. And so you're absolutely right. I think that that's one of the things that we don't really think about. And you mentioned the social determinants of health. And one of the things that they've just found is that incarceration is a social determinant of health.
It absolutely is.
And so if you want to talk a little bit about that,
Absolutely. Just because, and because you work so long, and I'm pretty sure everybody knows somebody, most folk know somebody that's been incarcerated. Especially in Black community, just because of the incarceration rates, right? When we think about the social determinants of health and incarceration, and we think about all the ways that incarceration impacts an individual, it not only impacts the individual with the mental health, the trauma of being incarcerated. Incarceration itself is a trauma. Right. That's what they're saying. Just being incarcerated is a trauma. There's data that shows, and I'll get it over to you because it's fascinating data that shows how even a couple days in jail can turn a Black man off from voting for the rest of their life. Just the negative experience, just saying I'm never voting again, right? And so some of the other work, Curtis, is trying to make sure that folk in Michigan know that you can vote with a felony conviction, right? In Michigan, you get your voting rights back as soon as you step out the door. You can vote on parole, on probation, on tether. You can vote while you're in jail if you haven't been convicted.
Wow.
Pre-trial.
And a lot of people don't know that.
I know. So exactly.
Wow.
So that's some of the other work trying to make sure that community knows this stuff. But yes, the social determinants of health, incarceration is a trauma in it of itself, and we know it impacts health. You know, folk come out of prison with diabetes, a lot of health concerns, a lot of undiagnosed health concerns as well, Curtis. Right?
Wow.
Folk don't even know that they're suffering from stuff. And so that's another reason why the CDC was very determined to make incarceration a social determinant of health.
Wow. And that's interesting you said that, because I do know that when an individual goes into prison, they say that they age 15 years automatically. They age 15 years automatically.
I believe.
Yeah. There's and the reason behind that is because of the stress. The stress. You know, especially for a first-time offender. Person who has never been in jail, all of a sudden now they've been introduced into that prison environment, they age 15 years. In addition to that, a lot of individuals that sometimes go into prison, they're already, health-wise, they're already train wrecks. They're already train wrecks because of the lifestyle that they may have lived out there, right? You know, so a lot of them come in, like you said, diabetes, hypertension issues, all of that. And then in concert with the fact that they have experienced trauma at very young age, right? You know, there is a study, and I know that you're familiar with this, called the ACEs study, adult childhood.
What is the East? I'm not sure.
Experiences. I think
it might be experiences.
Yeah, but that's an interesting study, because that study basically states that, hey, look, trauma as a child is going to tell whether that person is going to become an alcoholic, drug dependent. They're going to have diabetes, hypertension, and then they get all those things and go into prison.
Right. And it's worse, right?
And it's worse.
And there's even studies and data that shows that folk, especially folk that struggle like with substance use issues, how they, once they're out, right, after a long period of time, assuming that they've been, you know, sober that entire incarceration period, that they overdose at really alarming rates, because right, they haven't had it, they come back out into the environment, think everything is the same, and they overdose. So people die at alarming rates within the first 2 to 3 weeks of release from prison. So that there's when we think about the criminal legal system, it's like an onion, Curtis. It's a lot of layers. I don't even think we've ever even thought about, like, how do we determine the harm to Black community for mass incarceration? How do we calculate that?
Wow.
All the jobs, all the money that folk didn't make, didn't contribute, all the money that left the community that went to the prison.
Wow.
Like, how do we calculate all the harms? But it's definitely been a lot of harms to community because of mass incarceration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that, you know, I think is so important that we need to look at, to sort of, you know, like you said, to peel back, look at some of those particular issues, but then all of a sudden also be able to decrease some of that prison population, right? You know, right now, as you know, 2.1 million people are in United States prisons, state, federal, and the terrible thing, it's good, but terrible at the same time, is that 96% of those people are going to get out, right? But what are they getting out to? Where are they going to? And are they going to go back, right? And so I do know that a lot of the facilities have put a lot of focus on rehabilitation. But I always say that those programs are only good if the people teachable, if the individuals are teachable. But I do know, and I'm a big proponent of rehabilitation programs, cognitive behavior therapy, programs like Thinking for a Change that really sort of get to the heart of the matter and sort of teach individuals how to solve new ways to problem solve, right?
Absolutely.
Because if you're a young kid and you were taught as a very young child to solve your problems with fists and feet, right?
Right.
You know, you're going to do that as a teenager, you're going to do that as an adult, and then before you know it, you know, you're seeing somebody like myself.
Absolutely.
Right. And so Thinking for a Change, I'm a big proponent of that, really sort of teach people how to think through some of those things. But I also have to say it's difficult, especially in an environment like prison, right? You know, so programs like Thinking for a Change, let's say, for example, CBT programs, you're familiar with those programs,
Absolutely.
right? what do you think in terms of having those particular programs, having participants be in that program, and then also living in a prison environment? How would that work, and how can a person navigate through that?
It works differently, right?
Hmm.
Some prisons, every prison is different. You know
Hmm.
this, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so it really depends on the environment
Hmm.
that folk are in, and 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 I hate to make it so individualistic, but
Hmm.
it depends on how the individual, right, the person, whether or not they really want to try to apply this, or whether or not they're using it kind of as as a tool to get out, which it
Right.
makes sense because everybody wants out of prison. I
Yep.
don't, so that makes perfect sense. I've seen environments where it's been done really well, where folk in those CBT type programs were housed in one unit all
Hmm.
together, kind of working the program together with staff at the same time. So there was staff buy-in, everybody in the unit was working the program. So in those type of situations, it works really well. And then you see other situations where folk are kind of spread about.
Hmm.
It can still work, but it's not as effective as like just everybody being on the same page in the same unit, working the same program.
Right. And that's and you're right. I think one of those things is that, for correctional administrators, they have to know their population, right? And they have to give their population an opportunity to be successful. I remember in the last few facilities that I worked in, we had what we call honor dorms, right? We had those individuals that didn't create any, that didn't have any disciplinary history,
Hmm.
individuals that were in school, and serious about, and I think they're also within like a year
Hmm.
of MSRing, right?
Okay.
Discharging, and so those individuals were really heavy into CPT programs, and it worked. Those
Hmm.
units never had any problems. And of course, they don't want any problems because they want to stay in those
Right, right,
units, right?
right, right.
They get
Absolutely.
special privileges.
Right. There's an incentive.
There's an incentive behind that, and so, but I think one of the things that we need to do in community and society is also provide incentives, not just for, and this is where I sort of want to unpack a little bit about alternative sentencings and sanctions,
Hmm.
and because, for example, there are a lot of people that I think that are in prison and should not be in prison, right?
Hmm.
They should be afforded the opportunity for alternative sanctions, especially those individuals that may not committed nonviolent
Hmm.
offenses.
Hmm.
So let's say, for example, we see it all the time. Politicians, business leaders, those individuals that go to prison, federal prison for tax evasion, right?
Hmm.
To me, that is a waste of resource, right?
Okay.
That is, those are individuals that should be provided with an alternative sense. Not because I'm saying because we need to treat them with kid gloves. No, what I'm saying is that what we can do is we should be in the business of saying, hey, look, this particular individual could be sentenced to work with disenfranchised, marginalized communities
Hmm.
and teach individuals how to create real estate opportunities, to create businesses, things of
Hmm.
that particular nature. That way, those particular individuals in that community can learn something different, can learn a whole new skill set. Now, I understand the other side of that
Hmm.
argument is, oh, so you're gonna let them get off the hook? No, I'm not saying let them get off the hook, but maybe they do that in the daytime and then they go back to a sort of like a halfway house or
Hmm.
something to that particular um, option. But what I'm saying is that I think that we should be in the business of looking at alternative sanctions. Everybody who commits a crime don't necessarily need to go to prison. Prison is not for everybody and should not be for everybody. It is a burden on, not only, like you said, it decimated many African American communities of color, especially in the 1980s with the whole crack epidemic that went on, and so I was going to say something else, but I don't want to bleed into other conversations.
Okay.
And those other conversations, it was
80s and 90s.
the
Yeah,
80s and
absolutely.
90s. It was a criminal offense. If you get found with some rock cocaine,
Hmm.
you were going to the big house. You
Hmm.
were going out. But now all of a sudden, with the opioid crisis, we call it a healthcare issue. It is
Absolutely.
a epidemic, and let's look at treatment
Hmm.
instead of incarceration, which I think is good. Which I think is
Absolutely.
good. Um, but that's something that we should probably also had applied back in the 80s and 90s and not decimated so many communities.
So yeah, not everybody deserves to be in prison. Absolutely. Right. I think there are folk incarcerated right now in this state, folks that have served long sentences. They're frail, they're elderly. We're spending a lot of money to house them. We should definitely be considering letting those folk out. The only reason we would keep them in there at this point in their 80s and 90s and can barely walk would just be punitive, right? Revenge, and it just doesn't make sense, right? So those folks, and I think we've gone a long way, at least in Michigan, in trying to get a lot of those nonviolent offenses out of prison and creating alternative sentencing structures in different counties in the state. But I'll also say, like, we can't get, one of the things, if we really want to reduce the prison population, we can't get there because we've been trying it just by focusing on folk that we consider to be nonviolent or they really didn't do that much because they shouldn't be there anyway. And they're the easiest ones to get out. We're going to have some really difficult conversations as a state and as a community around folk that we that have committed violent offenses, right? Because they now make up the bulk of the prison population because we kind of got everybody else out. Right. And they're the difficult conversations that folk don't want to have, right? So the question, that was one of the things that I was talking about, the policy from last session, which would allow sentencing judges to resentence folk if they think they've made a change after 20 years of sentencing. I know folk that have been in there, I want to say, let me see, I've been home almost 10, like 35 years. And as the saying goes, they still ain't short. Right. They got 35, and they still not short. 35. And so I don't know, I know we got to make some changes. I think like some of these sentences that we're having folks serve that were really young when they committed these offenses, I think are a little insane. And I guess, we have to have the conversation about like how do folks that have been harmed by people feel about this. And I don't know. I think it's better for society if we can get folk out of prison, especially folks that have served long periods of time. Right.
Exactly. Yep. And clemency, compassionate releases are definitely something that is needed. Like you said, we have a lot of people that are terminally ill, a lot of people that are old and frail, and they can best be because, a lot of state and federal budgets are strapped by the corrections. I think here in Michigan, the third highest budget outside of transportation is corrections. I think it is.
I'll check.
Yeah,
I'll check.
I think it is.
I know it's up there.
Yeah,
we spend a lot of money on. We spend a lot of money on prison.
Yes, we spend a lot of money locking people up. But that's definitely something that's needed. But I really appreciate this conversation. I think this has been a good conversation, and I think it definitely opens up the doors for more conversation, insightful conversation in terms of how we can turn some of this around.
Absolutely.
I think it's important to do that. So, but no, man, I just want to tell you, I really appreciate the opportunity that you get to share with me and talk a little bit about yourself, and hopefully the audience out there will be able to take all of this in and learn something new.
Absolutely.
Again, like I said, it is my intention always to educate, enlighten, and if you get an opportunity to entertain a little bit. But I do understand that this is one of those kind of conversations that is really no laughing matter. Right. It's not a laughing matter, and it's something that we definitely need to be serious about, and really try to move the needle forward and try to find a pathway forward to address some of these issues, because these things affect so many people.
They do.
Affect so many people.
And not just the individuals, Curtis, right?
Right.
The children.
Yeah.
Michigan has some of the highest parental incarceration rates in the country.
Wow.
Right? The national average, I think, is around 8.
Wow.
Michigan is above 10.
Wow.
And so you got children, and we know that children that have parents that are incarcerated, they struggle in school.
Yes.
They often, they get suspended.
Yeah.
They struggle with their classes. And so there's a whole ripple effect around this stuff that we don't always think about.
Right. Right.
We don't always think about,
Right.
because we're so gun-ho on we're going to make this one person
Right.
suffer without realizing all the other collateral consequences
Yeah.
that flow from trying to make this one individual suffer.
And that's a really good point. And you touching on something else, and I know we're ready to close, but but it was a really good point, because in one of the things that I know, that whole conversation around immigration, when they were talking about they wanted to keep the families together and that they didn't want the parents to be separated from the children. And I sort of reflected on it, and I said, well, what about all the women that go to prison every year? What about their children? You're going to tell me that, and these are American citizens.
Absolutely.
These are American citizens that we're talking about. And so, so many of those children either end up home with Big Mama or with their grandparents, if they're fortunate enough to have that, right? But then some of them don't even have that. They go to foster care.
They do.
And
that's a whole nother can of worms.
Right.
In and of itself. Yes, I think you are right. This is a serious conversation. I'm glad that you got me on here to talk about it. I appreciate the fact that you're so concerned about it.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah. And and it's important. And like I said, although I'm a correctional administrator, but I think these are things that a lot of correctional administrators have, both from a professional standpoint and also from a personal standpoint. Right?
Absolutely.
Because these things affect us all. And like I said, many of us have family members that have been exposed to these kind of things. And so it is important to continue to unpack this conversation and continue to dialogue about it. But again, Tony, thanks so much, man. I appreciate you.
I appreciate
yes,
you.
Sir. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Appreciate the conversation. So that will be it, folks, for the Oneal Perspective. Again, look forward to more insightful, thoughtful episodes. Again, I want you guys to remember to stay engaged, stay sharp, and stay focused. Thanks so much.
That's all for today's episode of The Oneal Perspective, Politics, Power, and Policy. I hope you learned something new, got inspired, and maybe had a little fun along the way. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and join us next time for more thought-provoking conversations. Until then, stay informed and stay empowered.